So, hi.
Yeah, right?
Yes.
Deal?
Going.
Welcome to the Acquia podcast, Drupal technology, community, and business.
Welcome to the Acquia podcast, Drupal technology, community, and business.
There's a module for that?
Of course there is. Angie Byron, aka WebChick, and I are at NYC Camp 2014 at the United Nations headquarters. All of this new functionality in Drupal 8 is thanks to some rather radical re-architecturing of Drupal's internals in a lot of places. But that re-architecturing gives us also simplicity benefits and some other major improvements in the developer experience. People working with Drupal, learning Drupal for the first time. Can you talk about that a little?
Yeah. So, you're exactly right. Like one of the, in addition to the user-facing changes, which are pretty significant, there's also been very significant refactoring under the hood to essentially turn Drupal, which was traditionally a procedural and naming convention basically based application, to something more object-oriented, extensible through modern architecture. And by modern, I mean like 40 years ago. So but modern for PHP, architecture that is more in line with what everyone else is doing. And it's not been without its contention for sure. So I want to talk a little bit about the origins of that, which was, Dries, who's the project lead of Drupal, really felt that with Drupal 7, we had really reached this tipping point where Drupal 6 and below were this really easily accessible, hackable system where you could just jump in with pretty very little knowledge and sort of, hack things together until you kind of got something working and then move on. Because it used raw SQL to query the database. You just had to use naming conventions for things. But in Drupal 7, we sort of broke that mold, and Drupal 7 became a little more advanced, to the point where we actually use an not an ORM, but an object-oriented database abstraction layer. And we started getting into things like automated tests, and we had a new entity system that required knowledge of all these different parts. And so it became the point where it was too inaccessible for just weekend hackers to just jump into and fix. But then at the same time, the ways that we extended Drupal in Drupal 7 and below were just oddball to people who were used to any other language. I remember actually when I came into Drupal, I was a summer of code student, and I had to learn what hooks were, and I could not figure it out because I had learned things like Java and C# and all these things in school. And I had done a little bit of PHP programming as well, on the side, but never had I heard of something where I name a function a certain way and then all of a sudden it triggers an event, and it was just foreign concept to me. And it's a foreign concept to everybody, and you have to train them on what that is. And so Dries really felt it was important that since we hit this tipping point, we either need to simplify Drupal, go back to the old days where it was hackable and things, which didn't seem like it was realistic because we'd made it all that flexible for a reason. There were valid reasons for all of it. Or move in the other direction and start embracing these modern standards and patterns that are in other languages and other frameworks, and making it so that it's more accessible to a broader spectrum of developers. And so that's the direction that he chose to take the project in, and that's the direction we went with. So what I think you'll find when Drupal 8 is out, right now, we're still building it, so it's a bit of a mess. But when Drupal 8 actually is shipping, I think what you'll find is if you have any experience in any other language other than PHP, it will be really accessible to you. It uses classes, inheritance, it uses interfaces, it has namespaces, all of the stuff that you'd expect from modern programming languages is all in there. If you learned PHP before 1996 or so, it's going to be a little challenging for you because before PHP 5, PHP didn't really do object-oriented programming. So a lot of us who learned back in the day just, print variables and a bunch of functions, and we call them and things like that. And if you've never had experience with object-oriented programming, it will be a bit challenging. But if you've learned PHP anytime from when PHP 5 came out on, it's going to be pretty accessible to you because it's all the same stuff that you've seen. And if you've done any work with Symfony or Laravel or any of these other PHP frameworks, it's all going to look the same to you. And we've actually seen a lot of really positive, every time I give my Drupal 8 talk at a camp, I say, how many people does this look familiar to you? When I show code samples and the whole room raises their hands. So I think what our challenge as a community is that subset of people who either learned PHP back in the day, like myself, or people who learned PHP via Drupal because they started out not knowing any PHP and then kind of had to learn it to extend Drupal, they're going to have a tougher time because there's a lot of concepts for them to learn. But the good news is, because every other language works this way, there's a ton of resources out there to help you understand what object-oriented programming is. And the thing that I really like about it is, instead of it working off of people's goodwill of following conventions, it actually enforces like guidelines and rules and structures so that programming is actually easier to understand. So so that's what I can say about the developer experience. A couple of specific examples would be, in Drupal 7, if you wanted to make a field, there's something like 10 or 12 field hooks. And you need to implement, I think, 4 of them, but you have no idea which ones. And so what I often do is I just give up and I just copy and paste text module and start changing it, Versus in object-oriented programming, what you get is an interface, which is a single file that defines it defines the API for what you're working with. So it has functions like, I don't know, in the case of fields, it would probably have functions like validate and save, and then this is what I can do with a field. And all the documentation is right there. And so it's actually really, really helpful, I think, for new developers to understand Drupal. And the existing developers who already know all of the concepts, so they won't have to come up to speed on things like entities and views. They'll just have to come up to speed on the object orientation stuff. But there's a huge commitment from all the people working on Drupal 8 to get the documentation right, get the developer experience right, so that people come to Drupal 8 and they love it. So that's what we're working on right now as we try to get Drupal 8 into beta.
There's also been a lot of unification around the internal, like the CRUD operations.
Yep.
Now in Drupal 8, if you learn how one system works, those principles are going to work across all of the internals.
Yeah,
and how many were there in Drupal 7?
Well, it's a little bit apples and oranges, because in Drupal 7, it was hooks for everything. So you learn one extension mechanism, which is a hook, but then there's like 50 different ways of using hooks. There's info hooks, there's event-driven hooks, there's all this kind of stuff. In Drupal 8, we sort of give you access to all of those systems. So if you learn YAML, and you learn the plugin system, and you learn how to make controllers, that's a huge chunk of Drupal right there. Because like plugins, for example, once you learn plugins, that single API will be applicable to blocks, image styles, text formats, like all kinds of different things. As opposed to in Drupal 7 and below, each of those had a separate, distinct API that was different from one another. You had to learn each one's different course. Yeah. So it's definitely going to be challenging for people upgrading their modules if they've never dealt with object-oriented programming before. But once they have, it's pretty awesome. And there's a lot of tools out there. There's the Drupal Module Upgrader project, which will attempt to port your code for you. There's a scaffolding project that was talked about here. I don't remember the URL of it. Hopefully we can get that. But there's a scaffolding project which actually generates the code for you if you know you want this, that, or the other thing. And so there's a lot of people are doing a lot of work to make that transition as easy as possible.
Scaffolding is done by Jesus Manuel Olivas,
that's
and
right.
He is going to be coming on the podcast to demo that.
There you go.
And we will link to that here.
Okay, perfect. Yeah.
Drupal 8 is incorporating all sorts of aspects from off of our old isolated Drupal island, right? Not only do we have an up-to-date supported fast version of PHP in PHP 5.4, but we've got external libraries and all sorts of helpful pieces from Symfony 2, from Guzzle, front-end stuff. We've gone through the bazaar and collected a whole bunch of stuff. I've been getting out, meeting some of the people in those communities and getting to know those other open source projects better, and it's incredibly... I've been welcomed, and people are telling me, hey, you Drupal kids, you're back,
Yep.
And they're getting excited about integration projects, about taking Drupal as their content management layer instead of building something every time. What's your impression of our reception in the greater PHP world with these changes that are going on?
Yeah, I think our reception has been great. I feel like PHP itself as a language is kind of going through a renaissance right now, where PHP kind of has this reputation as this ugly, nasty little language that's full of security holes and stuff. And what I've seen is a lot of people, especially lately, sort of trying to figure out how can we better work together as the global PHP community, how can we start addressing some of these things in PHP core? And it's actually been really exciting to be part of that. I feel like Drupal, in particular, like as we've started moving towards helping these other projects upstream, we've been very well received, and vice versa. I think we've had Symfony folks at the DrupalCon in Portland, had a big sprint there with those guys, and I think the reception has been phenomenal. I think the opportunities there are huge. We have examples of where we've fixed bugs for us, and then they get used by dozens of other projects, which just feels really, really great. And similarly, we get to benefit from similar things when someone who uses Guzzle fixes a bug in Guzzle, we update the new version of Guzzle, we get new features. It's win-win all around. And I feel like it's really helped Drupal's reputation as a project in the global PHP community. It's really important because the global PHP community is enormous, and we can stand to benefit a lot from learning from them and also teaching other people what we've learned.
So we're sort of scaling out our open source practice, right? We're not just sharing with each other in our little Echo Drupal beautiful.
It's a beautifully adorned echo chamber, but yes, it's... Yeah.
But we've opened the windows and we're getting some...
We're getting some air in there. And I think I think for the most part that's been great. There's some people who, I think Drupal got criticized a lot in the past for sort of this not invented here syndrome. Like we think we can do things better than everybody else, and I think that overall mind shift that has happened within the core development team that well, maybe we could do it better, or maybe they can do it better, and we could just use what they've got and then spend our time working on our problems instead of those other problems. And I think overall, and then there's some challenges there with how we're going to manage security releases and things like that shouldn't be taken lightly. And we've got plans in the works for how we're going to do all that. But I think on the whole, what we'll see is in Drupal 8, something that not only combines sort of best of breed technologies from all over the place in PHP, but also something that instead of Drupal only being good at this much of the web problems out there, could actually expand the entire scope. Because if Drupal's great if you need community and users and you need products or content, that kind of thing. But then if you just want to set up like a one-page site that just has a search box on it, something like that, you can use Drupal for it, but it's not like great at it. But by Drupal expanding to take the entire full stack of PHP down to the low-level isolated framework components all the way up to an application level, I think it's excellent because you learn one platform and you can do anything.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
And thanks for all the hard work on Drupal 8 to you and sort of to everyone else as well. Thank you. I'm really excited.
Thanks to the 2,000 people who have contributed to Drupal 8.
Have we hit 2,000 now?
Yep, we're 2011 now.
Okay, high five for that.
Yes, awesome. All right. Thanks a lot, Jen.
Thank you.
All right.
And Drupal 8 is incorporating components from Symfony 2, Guzzle.
Sorry.
I know it's very moving.
Oh, Guzzle.